Right now, it feels like we're all watching an oil crisis unfold. The energy markets are going haywire, governments are scrambling, and all the panic seems to point back to one single tiny spot on the map. But what if I told you the story we think we're seeing is only half the picture? To get the real story, you have to look right here.
This is the Strait of Hormuz. It's this narrow strip of water, the only way for ships to get from the Persian Gulf out to the open ocean. And its strategic importance? Well, it is almost impossible to overstate. Because every single day, this one little choke point sees about 20% of the entire world's daily oil supply pass right through it. Think about that. 20%. And because of that, the conventional wisdom, right? It's pretty straightforward. If something goes wrong here, if this thing gets shut down, the global economy is in for a world of hurt. But this is where things get really interesting, because that whole story assumes an energy shock hits everyone the same way. And folks, that's just not true anymore. The real story isn't just about what's happening. It's about who it's happening to. To really get it, we've got to start with one of the biggest economic shifts of the last 20 years, America's total energy transformation. See, your first instinct is to think this plays out like it did 20 years ago. Back then, yeah, the United States was super dependent on foreign oil. But today, oh, the script has been completely flipped. I mean, the scale of this change is just staggering. The US went from importing something like 60% of its petroleum to becoming the largest oil producer on the entire planet. How? Well, new drilling techniques unlocked these massive shale reserves, and production just exploded. So what this all means is that the old playbook is totally out of date. An oil shock in the Middle East doesn't automatically spell disaster for the US economy anymore. America is simply not on the same side of that trade, which of course begs the question, who is? And this, right here, is where we get to the absolute heart of it. Because any disruption in that strait creates what's called an asymmetric shock, meaning it does not hit everyone equally. Some get hurt way more than others. Just take a look at this. Where is all that oil actually going? Most of it isn't heading to the United States. In fact, only about 2.5% of it is. The vast majority, a staggering 75%, is headed to Asia. We're talking China, India, Japan, and South Korea. And this creates two totally different kinds of problems. For the US, a shutdown is mainly a price problem. See, oil is a global market, so prices go up for everyone. It hurts your wallet at the pump, for sure, but it's manageable. But for Asia, it's a price and a supply problem. Higher prices are one thing, but losing the actual physical supply of energy, that's when factories can shut down. That's when entire economies can grind to a halt. But believe it or not, this whole dynamic gets even more intense. Because oil, well, it's only one piece of the puzzle. There's a second layer to this that almost nobody is talking about. We've got to talk about natural gas. The Middle East is also a huge exporter of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and about 20% of the entire global supply passes right through the Strait of Hormuz. For countries like Qatar and the UAE, it's over 90% of their exports. So if the strait gets jammed up, it's a double whammy. It hammers both oil and gas markets at the same time. So, who do you think benefits when global gas supplies get tight? Well, guess who quietly became the world's largest exporter of LNG over the last decade? Yep, the United States. So the exact same dynamic plays out all over again. One region is desperate for supply, and another one, the US, is sitting there, perfectly positioned to sell it to them. So let's connect the dots. When a crisis hurts some countries while actually benefiting others, it stops being just a crisis, doesn't it? It becomes a tool. It becomes geopolitical leverage. And if we ask, okay, so who is the most exposed here? Who stands to lose the most in this whole scenario? The answer is crystal clear: China. I mean, just look at the sheer numbers. China burns through about 15.5 million barrels of oil every single day, and about 11 million of those are imported. A massive chunk of that comes directly from the Middle East, flowing right through the Strait of Hormuz. Now, to be fair, China isn't naive. They saw this risk coming a mile away. They've spent years getting ready, finding other suppliers, building up massive reserves. But here's the thing. Those are all great moves, but they don't solve the fundamental problem. They just buy time. They can handle a short-term shock, but a long, drawn-out disruption, that becomes a massive structural problem for an economy that absolutely depends on a steady flow of imported energy.
And that brings us to the final and maybe the most crucial piece of this whole puzzle. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, something about this whole situation just feels off. Not the conflict itself, but the timing of it. Because right as all these tensions were ratcheting up around the Strait of Hormuz, something else was happening halfway across the world. The United States and China were locked in these super critical trade negotiations over tariffs, technology, the whole shebang. And this kind of forces you to ask a different sort of question, doesn't it? Maybe these high-stakes negotiations aren't just about two sides trying to find a compromise. Maybe they're about finding and applying leverage. And when you look at the situation through that lens, the entire story just snaps into focus. The energy shock stops looking like a random crisis and starts looking like a powerful form of leverage, precisely because one country can handle it just fine, while the other feels immense structural pressure. Which leaves us with one final big idea to think about. Maybe the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a choke point for the flow of oil anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it's also become a choke point for the flow of global power.